We can be blind to the obvious, and we are also blind to our blindness. Daniel Kahneman. Exposure creep is the most common way systems die quietly, not through recklessness, not through panic, but through a series of decisions that each make sense in isolation and are almost impossible to object to in the moment they are made. This is why exposure creep rarely feels like a mistake. It feels like competence. Exposure creep does not begin with greed. It begins with confidence. Confidence built on familiarity, prior success, or deep understanding of a system. As confidence increases, the perceived need for restraint decreases. Limits that once felt appropriate start to feel conservative. The system does not break when those limits are questioned. It adapts. That adaptation is the beginning of a failure. The defining feature of exposure creep is that nothing feels wrong while it's happening. Positions are increased incrementally. Risk is reframed as conviction. Each adjustment is justified by new information, improved understanding, or changing conditions. The logic is sound. The intent is clean. And because the increases are small, there's no emotional alarm. This is why intelligent people are especially vulnerable. They can always explain why the additional exposure is reasonable. They understand the asset, the environment, the incentives. They are not acting impulsively. They are acting deliberately. That deliberateness is what makes exposure creep dangerous. It hides inside rationality. Another reason exposure creep goes unnoticed is that early outcomes often reward it. Increased exposure during favorable conditions amplifies gains. Success reinforces behavior. The system begins to associate increased size with correctness. This association is false, but it feels true. The market does not punish exposure immediately. It waits. Exposure creep also thrives on ambiguity. Limits exist, but they are interpreted rather than enforced. Rules are flexible. Thresholds are guidelines. When the system allows interpretation, interpretation will expand under pressure. The question shifts from is this allowed to is this justified? That shift is subtle but fatal. One of the most deceptive aspects of exposure creep is that it often masquerades as risk management. People believe they are reallocating capital, optimizing sizing, or responding to new information. In reality, they are increasing exposure without revisiting authority. Who is allowed to increase size? Under what conditions? At what point does conviction stop being an input? These questions are rarely answered explicitly. Exposure creep also compounds invisibly across strategies. No single position looks oversized. The system feels diversified, but correlations increase. Dependencies form. The total exposure becomes larger than intended, even though each individual decision appears modest. This is how systems end up carrying far more risk than their operators realize. What makes exposure creep especially dangerous is that it removes margin for error. Early in the system's life, mistakes are survivable. Exposure is low, drawdowns are tolerable. As exposure creeps upward, the same mistakes become consequential. The system hasn't become worse, it has become fragile. Fragility does not announce itself. It reveals itself only when conditions change. By the time volatility arrives, the opportunity to correct exposure has passed. Adjustments feel urgent. Urgency introduces emotion. Emotion accelerates decision making. The system collapses faster than anyone expects. It's important to understand that exposure creep is not a failure of discipline. People often say, after the fact, that they should have stuck to their rules. But rules that can be overridden in calm conditions will not survive stress. Exposure creep is a failure of governance, not willpower. Another signal of exposure creep is the way people talk about their positions. Language shifts. Terms like starter size disappear. Positions become core. Temporary increases become permanent. The narrative evolves to support the exposure rather than constrain it. This linguistic drift mirrors structural drift. Exposure creep also distorts perception of volatility. As size increases, normal fluctuations feel larger. Emotional reactions intensify. The operator becomes more sensitive to price movement, not because the market changed, but because exposure did. This heightened sensitivity further drives reactive behavior, completing the feedback loop. By the time exposure creep is recognized, it is usually too late to unwind cleanly. Reducing size feels like admitting error. The system resists correction. Loss aversion locks exposure in place. What began as rational adjustment becomes an emotional anchor. This section exists to establish a single diagnostic truth. If exposure can increase without explicit authority, it will. And if it increases without authority, it will eventually exceed the system's ability to absorb error. The collapse is not caused by the market. It is caused by silent structural drift. In the next section, we will examine how exposure creep penetrates otherwise disciplined systems. Not through obvious rule breaking, but through mechanisms that appear reasonable on the surface and corrosive underneath. Exposure creep does not enter through obvious violations. It enters through permission structures that were never formalized. Most systems that experience exposure creep are not chaotic. They have rules, they have processes, they even have risk language. What they lack is authority, clear, enforceable authority over when exposure is allowed to change. The first mechanism is winner scaling without hierarchy. A position performs well, confidence increases. The logic for adding exposure feels compelling. The thesis is working. The market is confirming. This deserves more capital. Each statement is defensible. What is missing is the question of who is allowed to decide that additional exposure is permitted. When that authority is implicit, conviction replaces governance. The second mechanism is reinterpretation of limits. Many systems define limits as ranges rather than absolutes. These ranges are intended to provide flexibility. In practice, they provide a cover. When conditions are favorable, the upper bounds feel conservative. When conditions change, the same bound feels irrelevant. Limits that are interpreted rather than enforced are not limits. They are suggestions. Another common entry point is correlation blindness. Exposure creep rarely appears as a single oversized position. It appears as multiple positions that behave the same way under stress. Each allocation feels modest. The system looks diversified, but the underlying drivers are shared. When exposure is evaluated in isolation rather than in aggregate, the total risk quietly exceeds intent. Time is another vector. Exposure increases are often described as temporary, a short-term adjustment, a tactical allocation. The system allows these changes without requiring reversal criteria. Temporary becomes extended. Extended becomes normal. Normal becomes permanent. Exposure has crept, not through a decision, but through neglect. Exposure creep also hides inside optimization language. People say they are rebalancing, refining, or improving efficiency. These words sound responsible. They imply control. In reality, they often mask directional bias. Exposure is increased in the direction of recent success and justified as improvement rather than risk expansion. The absence of friction accelerates all of this. When systems allow exposure to change quickly and easily, they invite adjustment. Adjustment feels productive. It creates activity. Over time, activity replaces intention. The system becomes reactive without realizing it. One of the most dangerous aspects of exposure creep is that it feeds on competence. People who are careful, analytical, and deeply engaged are more likely to adjust exposure thoughtfully, and therefore more frequently. Each adjustment is small. Each adjustment is reasoned. The accumulation is not. Exposure creep also interacts with identity. As exposure grows, positions become part of how the operator sees themselves. Reducing exposure begins to feel like self-doubt rather than risk management. The system loses the ability to say no, because no one has been assigned the role of saying it. Another mechanism is delayed feedback. Exposure increases during calm periods do not immediately reveal their cost. Volatility remains low, drawdowns are shallow, the system appears stable. This reinforces the belief that increased exposure is safe. When volatility returns, the cost is paid all at once. What makes this mechanism so effective is that none of them require bad intentions. They are not driven by recklessness or greed. They are driven by responsiveness. Responsiveness without constraint is indistinguishable from drift. At no point does the system announce the exposure has exceeded its design. There's no alarm. There's no threshold crossing moment that feels decisive. This is why people are often shocked by how fragile their system feels under stress. They believe they were operating within bounds. In reality, the bounds had moved. Exposure creep ultimately reveals itself through sensation rather than metrics. Decisions feel heavier. Volatility feels sharper. Attention narrows. Sleep worsens. These are not psychological weaknesses. They are signals that exposure has outpaced control. This section exists to clarify a hard truth. Discipline at the execution level cannot compensate for missing governance at the control level. Systems that rely on individuals to notice when exposure has become excessive will notice too late. In the final section, we will resolve this structurally by showing why exposure limits must exist above conviction and how the control layer prevents silent expansion before it becomes dangerous. By this point, the pattern should be clear. Exposure creep does not come from bad actors or weak discipline. It comes from placing conviction in a position of authority it was never meant to hold. Conviction is an input. Control is a governor. When conviction is allowed to overrule structure, systems expand until they break. Conviction is trustworthy because it is internal. It carries confidence, coherence, and emotional certainty. But conviction is not stable under changing conditions. It responds to recent outcomes. It intensifies after a success and weakens after a loss. Designing systems that rely on a conviction to regulate exposure is equivalent to designing brakes that respond to speed rather than limit it. This is why exposure limits cannot be discretionary. The moment exposure can increase because something feels right, the system has already surrendered control. Feelings are not the enemy. Authority without boundaries is. Control exists to protect the system from the operator's best intentions. A governed system does not ask whether increasing exposure is justified. It asks whether it is permitted. This distinction is critical. Justification invites debate. Permission enforces hierarchy. When limits are enforced mechanically, conviction becomes informational rather than directive. It can influence review, not execution. The most resilient systems treat exposure as hard variable. It is defined in advance. It is capped. It cannot expand quietly. Any increase requires explicit structural approval, not moment-to-moment confidence. This removes the silent drift that destroys coherence. Control above conviction also protects learning. When exposure is stable, outcomes can be evaluated honestly. Gains are not confused with correctness. Losses are not amplified into existential threats. Feedback becomes cleaner because behavior is consistent. Consistency is what allows systems to improve. Another benefit of this hierarchy is emotional decoupling. When exposure is capped externally, internal state becomes less influential. Volatility does not feel personal. Decisions are less reactive. The system absorbs variation without requiring intervention. This is what stability feels like in practice. Many people resist this idea because it feels restrictive. They fear that limits will prevent them from acting on insight. In reality, limits prevent insight from turning into excess. They preserve optionality by preventing overcommitment. The freedom they protect is long-term participation. The systems that last are not those that make the best decision in ideal conditions. They are the ones that survive their worst decisions without collapsing. Control ensures that mistakes remain small enough to learn from. Conviction without control ensures that mistakes scale. Exposure creep ends the moment authority is clarified. When the system, not the operator, decides how much risk can be carried, expression stops being silent. Risk becomes visible, intentional, and bounded. That is not conservatism. It is survivability. This is the purpose of the control layer. It does not question intelligence. It does not suppress conviction. It simply refuses to let either rewrite the system in real time. It preserves the original design when pressure would otherwise distort it. If there is one idea to carry forward from this video, it is this. Exposure should never be negotiated during execution. It should be designed before execution and enforced during it. Anything else is drift. In the next control layer briefing, we will examine another failure mode that operates just as quietly. Timeframe mixing. How collapsing time horizons distort behavior, and why systems that do not enforce temporal boundaries eventually sabotage themselves. I'll see you in the next one, my friend. Take care.